All right, we're looking at Chapter 2, Section 1, Chapter 2, Section 2 on conditional statements. First thing we're going to look at is the vocabulary. A conditional statement is a statement that can be written in the form if P, then Q, where P is the hypothesis and Q is the conclusion. So all our conditionals are set in that way. If the hypothesis, then the conclusion. You could say, if you do your chores, then you will get your allowance. You could say, if 2 plus 2 equals 4, then 3 plus 3 equals 8. Doesn't really matter if it's true or not, just so long as it's in that form. If P, then Q. If you scratch my back, then I will scratch yours. A shorthand way of writing that, instead of if P, then Q, is P arrow Q. It means the same thing. If the hypothesis, then the conclusion. It's just a very shorthand way of writing that. All right, so I have some examples. If you do your homework, then you'll do better on the test. In this case, the hypothesis is always the words right after the word if. You do your homework is the hypothesis. If the hypothesis, then the conclusion will be you'll do better on the test. There's my conclusion. So the hypothesis is always after the word if. The conclusion is always after the word then. The next one, if you clean your room, then you will get your allowance. So again, the hypothesis is after the word if. There's your hypothesis. And the conclusion is after the word then. There's my conclusion. Of course, on the last one as well, if an angle is obtuse, then it measures greater than 100. Same idea. Hypothesis always after the word if. Conclusion always after the word then. Doesn't necessarily have to be first and second. It's always the words if and then that we're concerned about. If hypothesis, then conclusion. Negation is another word we're going to be using. The negation of a condition is the opposite. So the negation of P is not P. An example of that would be, if you clean your room, then you will get your allowance. If that's my original statement, and I negate those two, the hypothesis and the conclusion, I get, if you don't clean your room, then you won't get your allowance. So again, the original, if you clean your room, then you will get your allowance. The negation of those two, if you don't clean your room, then you won't get your allowance. It's the opposite. All right, let's take a second. See if you can identify the hypothesis and the conclusion in these four statements. So in the first one, again, pretty easy. If, then, so if the hypothesis, person is 16 years or at least 16 years old, then the conclusion, the person can drive a car. And the second one, it's a little harder because it isn't in the form if, then. So we're still looking for those keywords though, that word if and the word then. Don't see any thens, but there is a word if. So the words after the word if, it is a rectangle. That is our hypothesis. Even though it doesn't come first, it's still after that word if. And our conclusion in red, a figure is a parallelogram. So the hypothesis, it is a rectangle. The conclusion, a figure is a parallelogram. In the next two, you'll notice there is no word if and there is no word then. In that case, when you don't see any ifs or any thens, what you're going to have to do is rewrite the statement as an if-then statement. So I'll read it here. The statement A minus B is less than A implies that B is a positive number. If I were to rewrite that as an if-then statement, it might look something like this. If A minus B is less than A, then B is a positive number. Okay, now I can identify the hypothesis and I can identify the conclusion. Here's my hypothesis. Here's my conclusion. This is not an easy process in terms of rewriting a statement in an if-then form. It takes practice. And it takes time. There's no formula. There's no easy way. You're just going to have to kind of look at it. The next one, the midpoint M of a segment bisects the segment. So if I read that, before it can bisect the segment, before I can get to this end piece down here, it has to be a midpoint. So the midpoint has to come first. Then we can say that it bisects the segment. Okay? So if I'm going to rewrite that, it might look like this. If M is the midpoint of a segment, then it bisects the segment. Okay? And now that it's in that if-then form, I can identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. Hypothesis, M is the midpoint of a segment. Conclusion, it bisects the segment. Okay? So rewriting those is going to take practice. You are going to have to work at that. All right? There's a couple ways we can reorder these conditional statements. One way is what's called the converse. The converse says, instead of if P then Q, the converse says if Q then P. We're just reordering the way the hypothesis and the conclusion appear. And we'll do some examples in a minute. But that's the converse. If Q, then P. Another way is the inverse. The inverse says if not P, then not Q. We're negating that original conditional. That example I gave earlier, if you don't do your homework, then you won't do well on the test, is the inverse. And the last way is what's called the contrapositive. Contrapositive says that if not Q, if not the conclusion, then not P, not the hypothesis. Now these can get tricky. The wording can get complicated. Take some practice, and I'm going to do some examples here in a second. But you'll be asked to write the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive of an original conditional statement. All right. So let's take a look at this example here. A butterfly has 4 wings. Okay, if I wanted to rewrite that in the form of an if-then statement as my conditional, I might say, if it's a butterfly, then it has 4 wings. If it is a butterfly, then it has 4 wings. So I have a hypothesis, I have a conclusion. Now, to do the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive, all I have to do is reorder this in different ways. So the converse was if Q, then P. So the converse of this statement would be, if it has 4 wings, then it is a butterfly. Now that's not necessarily true. If you can think of anything that has 4 wings and it's not a butterfly, the converse would be false. For instance, a dragonfly has 4 wings, but it is not a butterfly. So the converse is not always true, but that's how it's written, is reordering those hypothesis and conclusion. The inverse of this statement would be, if it is not a butterfly, then it doesn't have 4 wings. So that would be the inverse of this original conditional statement. The last one, the contrapositive, if it doesn't have 4 wings, then it isn't a butterfly. Those are just different ways that we can reorder this and we can look at the same sentence in different ways. Okay? So that's all for section 2.2, and good luck.